The version of the Horus Heresy that the internet has settled on goes like this. The emperor was too arrogant to warn his sons about chaos. Horus didn't know what he was walking into. If the emperor had just been honest, the galaxy doesn't burn. That version of events is wrong. Not slightly wrong, structurally wrong. Because Horus, at the exact moment of his corruption on Davin, wasn't an uninformed man stumbling into a trap he couldn't see. He had a loyalist warning inside that vision. He had enough information to doubt what he was being shown. And he still chose chaos, not from ignorance, but because his pride told him he deserved more than his father had given him. The Davin sequence is in the lore. It's in McNeill's False Gods, published by Black Library in June 2006, the second novel in the Horus Heresy series. Everything that matters about why this narrative went wrong is in that book. The question is whether you read it as a tragedy of deception or a tragedy of character. The dominant fan reading picked deception. The lore supports character. That distinction matters because the entire "emperor failed to communicate" verdict depends on a factual premise, that Horus was a victim of ignorance. If he wasn't ignorant, if he had access to a warning and dismissed it, the verdict changes. The moral weight of the heresy shifts, and the case against the emperor stops being a slam dunk. Here is what actually happened on Davin. Erebus, first chaplain of the Word-Bearers, had been engineering this for years before the battle. He stole an alien weapon called the anatheme, a chaos-tainted Xenos blade, from the Inerex during the Luna Wolves' first contact with that civilization. He arranged for it to reach Eugen Temba, the corrupted planetary governor of Davin's moon. He maneuvered Horus into attacking the moon personally. When Horus reached the bridge of Temba's wrecked flagship, he found the governor already mutated by Nurgle, the blade in hand. Horus killed Temba, but the anatheme wounded Horus in the shoulder first, a chaos-tainted weapon whose toxin resisted every conventional medical treatment the Luna Wolves' apothecaries could apply. The wound wouldn't close. Horus was dying. That's when Erebus made his second move. Using his influence over the warrior lodges already embedded within the Luna Wolves' legion, Erebus convinced Horus's officers that the only way to save the War Master was to take him to the Temple of the Serpent Lodge on Davin, officially described as a tribal warrior society, actually a chaos cult front. The Mournival was divided over it. Captain Garviel Loken, already suspicious of Erebus after tracing the anatheme back to the Inerex theft, argued against. He was outvoted. Horus's body was carried through the temple doors, which locked from within. Inside, the Davinite priests conducted a ritual. Horus's spirit was projected into a warp-mediated vision while his body remained comatose. A proxy was sacrificed to power the ceremony, and Erebus entered the vision alongside him, not as himself but disguised as Hastur Sejanus. Sejanus was dead. He was a captain of the Luna Wolves, a member of Horus's Mournival, killed earlier in the Great Crusade. He was someone Horus had mourned. Erebus wore his face and his voice to gain Horus's trust inside the vision, a familiar presence, calculated to lower the War Master's defenses at the most dangerous possible moment. What the vision showed Horus wasn't an education in chaos. It was something more targeted than that. Erebus, as Sejanus, guided Horus through a sequence of curated scenes, the Primarch gestation labs beneath Terra, showing the Emperor creating his sons using knowledge drawn from the warp, the very sorcerous methods the Imperial truth officially denied. Then, a vision of the future, the Imperium as it exists 10,000 years from now, authoritarian, stagnant, dominated by a massive religious cult that worships the emperor as a god.
The Primarchs absent, forgotten, discarded. Erebus framed this as evidence of the emperor's intent, not as prophecy of what would happen if Horus chose rebellion, but as proof of what the emperor had always planned. This is the mechanism worth examining closely, because it tells you something specific about where the actual vulnerability was located. The vision didn't offer Horus a tutorial on chaos. It didn't explain the nature of the chaos gods, their methods, their metaphysics, or what service to them actually entails. It offered him something else entirely, confirmation of what he already feared. Erebus wasn't delivering information. He was delivering validation. The vision wasn't an information delivery system. It was an ego confirmation system, a precise attack on the specific psychological architecture Chaos had identified in the War Master, aimed at the one wound that could actually turn him. That wound was pride. Specifically, the conviction of the most gifted being in the galaxy that he was being used, undervalued, and ultimately discardable. Horus Rising, Dan Abnett's first novel in the Heresy series, establishes this before Davin exists as a threat. Horus's relationship with the Emperor's approval is one of the defining tensions of his characterization from the opening pages. He spent 30 years as the Emperor's only discovered son, fighting alongside his father through the earliest campaigns of the Great Crusade, 30 years during which he was the Emperor's heir, confidant, and singular champion. Then, the other Primarchs were found, one by one, and Horus watched his unique position erode. He was still first. He was named War Master. But the Emperor withdrew to Terra for a project he wouldn't explain, leaving Horus to run the crusade alone. The fandom wiki's account of this period is direct. Horus was already jealous and resentful of the Emperor before the Davin vision, and that resentment made him all too receptive to what the ruinous powers would show him. That jealousy and resentment are placed before the Davin vision, not as products of it. The Sons of Horus Lexicanum entry captures the Legion's mentality in a single sentence. They spent decades fighting under the direct supervision of the Emperor himself, which led to them thinking of themselves as the preeminent Legion, and led to a prideful and confident mentality. The pride wasn't manufactured, it was structural, grown from 3 decades of reinforced supremacy, then quietly threatened by the Emperor's retreat and the redistribution of his attention across 20 sons. One community analysis of the pre-fall Horus puts it bluntly. He was a man who had never failed at anything he attempted, and a man like that could never be truly content as second in command. Another, he was the best at everything he ever tried. There is a distinction between healthy confidence and the specific vulnerability that Chaos needed, but the lore makes clear that even pre-Davin, Horus's sense of identity was deeply contingent on being first, on being seen as first, and on the Emperor's recognition confirming that status. Chaos didn't build that architecture. It found it, measured it, and cut precisely along its fault lines. Now come back to the vision. Erebus, wearing Sejanus's face, didn't need to convince Horus of anything Horus hadn't already suspected. The vision confirmed what Horus's latent resentment had been whispering to him since Ulanor, that the Emperor was using him, that the crusade was merely the Emperor's vehicle for achieving godhood, that his sons would be discarded once that ascension was complete. The future Imperium the vision showed, the one that corresponds to the actual 41st millennium setting, wasn't revealed as prophecy. It was presented as evidence of intent. The Chaos Gods depicted themselves as peaceful beings with no interest in the material universe,
under attack by the emperor who wanted to consume their power for his own apotheosis. There is a paradox embedded in this that the lore acknowledges. The future shown to Horus is, in some sense, accurate. The 41st Millennium Imperium really does look like what the vision described. But it looks that way because of what Horus chose on Davin. The vision's accuracy is downstream of his decision, not independent of it. Chaos showed Horus the consequence of his own rebellion and told him it was proof of his father's treachery. He couldn't see that. Nobody in his position could have seen that. But the self-fulfilling nature of the prophecy doesn't change what happened next, which is that before Horus accepted the vision's verdict, he received a warning. This is the moment that the dominant fan narrative consistently underemphasizes. It's not the moment the emperor appeared in the vision and warned Horus to stop. That claim requires a correction. The emperor does appear in the vision as a passive figure within the chaos-curated scenes, in the Primarch gestation labs, as an object of the religious cult in the future Imperium. He is there as evidence in the prosecution's case against him, not as an intervening presence. The loyalist warning came from Magnus the Red. Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, wasn't supposed to be in the vision at all. He intruded, as a psychic apparition, forcing his way into Horus's warp-mediated dreamscape through his own mastery of sorcery. Magnus intruded into Horus's vision, attempting to warn him that the vision was a deception created by chaos, and was expelled by the chaos powers before he could complete his warning. Magnus begged Horus not to give in. Then the chaos powers expelled him. Here is what the Lexicanum entry on false gods records, citing the novel directly. Aware that the visions he has seen are meaningless without context, but mistrustful of Magnus, who is obviously flouting the Edict of Nicaea, Horus asserts his own will and, full of pride, betrayal, and lust for power, decides, the text is worth parsing carefully. Horus knew, by his own assessment, that the visions were meaningless without context. He had Magnus's warning. He had enough information to conclude that the entire vision might be a constructed manipulation designed to turn him against his father. And then he chose chaos anyway. The reason he dismissed Magnus wasn't ignorance of the warning's content. It was the source. Magnus was using sorcery, a direct violation of the Edict of Nicaea, the imperial decree that had explicitly forbidden psychic powers across the legions. Horus was a rule follower, a legalist, deeply committed to the institutional authority of the Imperium he'd spent 2 centuries building. He dismissed the one loyalist voice in the vision by applying the wrong framework to the right warning. Magnus had committed a rules violation. Therefore, Magnus was untrustworthy. Therefore, the warning could be disregarded. This isn't ignorance. It's a failure of judgment rooted in exactly the character architecture that made Horus vulnerable in the first place. His pride extended to his own reasoning. He trusted his own assessment of Magnus's credibility more than he trusted the content of Magnus's message. He applied institutional rules to a metaphysical emergency. And then, per the novel's own language, he asserted his own will, full of pride, betrayal, and lust for power, and made his decision. Fandom wiki summaries of the novel add that Horus, in this moment, asserted that if anyone deserved to be worshipped as a god, it was he, not the emperor. Whether that's the exact wording or not, the Lexicanum's own description of his decision state, pride, betrayal, and lust for power, makes the argument without it. Those are internal states. That is his responsibility.
The pact Horus made with the Chaos Gods was direct.
Deliver the Emperor and the galaxy would be his. He agreed. There is a philosophical distinction that needs to be made explicit here, because it does real work in understanding where the moral weight actually falls. There are two separate questions that the Emperor failed to communicate. Argument collapses into one. The first is causal responsibility. Who created the conditions that made the heresy possible? The second is moral responsibility. Who bears blame for the specific choice made at Davin? The Emperor's causal responsibility is real and worth acknowledging. The imperial truth, the atheistic, rationalist, materialist ideology the Emperor promulgated across the entire Imperium, deliberately suppressed all knowledge of chaos, all religion, all acknowledgement of warp entities. This was a galaxy-wide policy, confirmed across every primary source. The logic embedded in the imperial truth, as best the lore supports it, was that chaos feeds on belief and worship, and that denying it acknowledgement at scale was the best available defense against its spread. The Emperor's withdrawal to Terra for the Webway project, a project he didn't explain to his sons, bred exactly the resentment and suspicion that made Horus receptive to Erebus's framing. These are real causal contributions. The Emperor's choices created conditions. But causal responsibility and moral responsibility are separable. The Emperor may have created conditions that made chaos able to target Horus. He doesn't bear moral responsibility for a choice Horus made after receiving a warning. Horus, inside the vision, had enough information to stop. He was told his guide was a deceiver. He acknowledged in the novel's own language that what he'd seen was meaningless without context. Then he asserted his will, chose the interpretation that confirmed his pride, and agreed to overthrow his father. Fan community discussion of The Fall captures Eldrad Ulthrin's assessment of this as one of the more precise statements in the discourse. Horus wasn't tricked into anything. He chose to fall. The Lexicanum's language for Horus at the moment of decision, full of pride, betrayal, and lust for power, describes internal states, not external compulsions. Those are his states. That is his responsibility. Here is where the Emperor should have told them argument runs into another problem, one that extends beyond Horus specifically and reaches every traitor Primarch. The vulnerabilities Chaos exploited across the traitor Primarchs weren't information gaps. They were character fractures, and none of them were created by the Emperor's silence about chaos. Walk through them briefly. Angron, the Butcher's nails, the cortical implants that amplified his aggression while slowly destroying his ability to experience anything except violence, weren't implanted by the Emperor. They were implanted on Nuceria, the slave world where Angron was raised as a gladiatorial fighter, as punishment for rebellion. The Emperor found Angron with the nails already in place. A World Eater's librarian who later examined Angron's mind concluded that, without the nails, he would have been the greatest of all the Primarchs. The rage and self-destruction that Chaos eventually weaponized were externally created before the Emperor arrived. Chaos exploited a wound it didn't make, and the Emperor didn't make. Mortarion. The fandom wiki's account of Mortarion's childhood on Barbarous is unambiguous about the source of his wound. He grew up under Nikaer, a chaos-touched overlord who adopted him, trained him, and then watched him build an army and a life's purpose around the goal of killing Nikaer himself. When the Emperor arrived on Barbarous, he killed Nikaer before Mortarion could.
The fandom wiki is explicit. The Emperor's slaying of the Primarch's adoptive father, the denial of his final vengeance, of the proof that he was worthy,
became a grudge Mortarion forever after held against him. That wound, the defining humiliation of being denied the kill that would have proved him, predated any chaos contact by Mortarion. Nurgle found it later. Nurgle didn't create it. Fulgrim. The fandom wiki opens his fall section with an epigraph from the Apocrypha Terra. Pride goeth before abandon, vanity goeth before weakness, vainglory goeth before the fall. His perfectionism, his vanity, his hunger for transcendence, these are characterized across multiple sources as innate, present from his earliest days on Chemos, intensified by his role leading an emperor's children who built their entire legion culture around achieving perfection. His perfectionism predated the heresy. Community analysis is consistent on this. Fulgrim, for all his positive qualities, was also vain, prideful, and incredibly insecure. He was always going to fall to chaos. Lorgar. This case is, if anything, the sharpest parallel to Horus's, because the Emperor actually did warn Lorgar, not inside a vision, but in direct, real-world communication, multiple times before the decisive intervention. The Emperor told Lorgar repeatedly to stop building cities and cults in his honor, to stop treating him as a god, to stop spreading religious devotion as the instrument of imperial compliance. Lorgar ignored the warnings. When the Emperor finally acted, ordering Guilliman to raise Monarchia, the perfect city Lorgar had built as a monument to the Emperor's divinity, and making the entire Word-Bearer's Legion kneel in penance, Lorgar's response wasn't to abandon his religious need. It was to redirect it. He found the Chaos Gods, who would accept his worship. His need for faith was structural, pre-existing, and unaddressed by any amount of imperial communication about chaos's nature. The Emperor told Lorgar what he was doing wrong. Lorgar fell anyway. The pattern is the same across all four. Chaos found wounds. It didn't make them. The Emperor's silence about the warp was a policy decision with real consequences, but those consequences flow from chaos having vectors of attack, not from the victims lacking information that would have protected them. None of these fractures were information gaps. None of them would have been sealed by an honest conversation about warp entities. Angron's nails would still be destroying his neurology. Mortarion's humiliation would still be festering. Fulgrim's perfectionism would still be unsatisfied. Lorgar's hunger for worship would still be looking for an object. Chaos cataloged these wounds. The Emperor's silence gave Chaos no material advantage in exploiting them. The "tell them about chaos" policy argument dissolves when you trace it through to where the actual damage was done. There is still the chaos vision itself as a counter-argument to consider. Some community analysis argues that the vision was so expertly constructed, so perfectly targeted by entities with millennia of experience corrupting souls, that Horus's choice was less free than the word choice implies. Divine-level manipulation by four chaos gods working in concert against a being who was physically weakened, emotionally destabilized, and operating under a manufactured emotional frame. That isn't, the argument goes, the same as a fully free agent making a fully informed decision. This is worth taking seriously. Horus wasn't clinically neutral when the vision hit. He was dying, physically, from a soul-targeting wound. He was emotionally destabilized by years of accumulating resentment he'd never fully confronted. The false gods cover description captures it directly. Horus is still battling against the jealousy and resentment of his brother Primarchs, and when he is injured in combat on the planet Davin, he must also battle his inner demons.
The inner demons preceded the outer ones. The vision exploited a mind that was already primed. But this argument,
taken to its logical end, proves the thesis rather than undermining it. If Horus's weakness wasn't ignorance, if it was pride, resentment, and latent jealousy, then informing him about chaos before Davin wouldn't have addressed the vulnerability chaos needed to exploit. A Horus who understood the chaos gods intellectually, who knew their nature and their methods, would still have been a Horus who feared abandonment and believed he deserved more than his father had given him. Chaos didn't need to teach him anything. It needed to confirm what he already feared. And Magnus's warning, which came without Chaos's framing and without Erebus's emotional scaffolding, got dismissed precisely because it arrived through a rule-breaker Horus's pride wouldn't respect. The weapon Chaos chose tells you what it thought would work. It chose an ego confirmation system, not an information delivery system. If ignorance had been the exploitable gap, Chaos would have delivered a factual briefing about the warp. Instead, it delivered validation. It told Horus he was right about everything he'd ever suspected, that his father was the real enemy, that he alone could save humanity from the Emperor's betrayal. That's not a knowledge transfer. That's a pride-targeting precision strike. Chaos identified the actual weakness. Its own method of attack is the clearest evidence for where the vulnerability was located. After the vision, Horus emerged from the Serpent Lodge physically healed. His wound, which no imperial medicine had been able to treat, closed. His legion celebrated his return. They had no idea that the man who walked out of the Delphos wasn't the man who had walked in, or, more precisely, that the man who walked out had always contained what walked out, and the 9 days in the lodge had simply given it permission to emerge. The subsequent moves were deliberate and methodical. Horus converted Angron of the World Eaters, Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, and Mortarion of the Death Guard to his cause. He secretly recruited Conrad Kurz of the Night Lords, Alfarius Omegon of the Alpha Legion, and Perturabo of the Iron Warriors. He turned the Fabricator General of the Mechanicus, founding what would become the Dark Mechanicum. He engineered the Istvan III atrocity, a virus bomb obliteration of 12 billion people and hundreds of space marines, including all loyalist elements from the 4 legions in his direct command, followed by the Istvan V drop site massacre, where 4 legions turned on 3 and the traitor war became irreversible. These weren't the actions of a confused man. They were the actions of a strategist who had made his decision and was executing it with the same genius that had made him War Master. The Horus Heresy ran from 005 Bot M31 to 014 Bot M31. Horus died aboard the Vengeful Spirit when the Emperor, boarding the flagship personally after Horus deliberately lowered its shields in a final gambit to end the war, destroyed him in direct combat, and then destroyed his soul entirely, preventing any possibility of resurrection or chaos exploitation. The Emperor, mortally wounded in the duel, was interred on the Golden Throne, where he has sustained the Astronomicon and his own attenuated existence through the psychic sacrifice of 1,000 souls per day for 10,000 years. The 41st Millennium Imperium, the authoritarian, stagnant, religiously fanatical empire Horus saw in the vision as proof of his father's betrayal, exists because Horus chose to create it. The vision's accuracy is its own confession. What Erebus showed Horus as evidence was actually consequence. Horus looked at the downstream result of his own decision and called it the reason for that decision. The logical circularity was invisible to him in the moment, and chaos made sure it stayed invisible.
There is a version of the Horus Heresy that casts the Emperor as a cold architect who understood exactly what his son would do and built his plans around it.
The lore on this question is genuinely contested. One faction of community reading holds that the emperor had no foreknowledge and the heresy blindsided him. Another reads later material as suggesting the emperor saw branching possible futures, including Horus's fall, and proceeded anyway. Neither reading is settled canon. What is settled is that the emperor's response to being told about the heresy, once Garrow's warning reached Terra via the Eisenstein, was to order an investigation rather than an immediate mobilization, suggesting he either didn't believe it or couldn't believe it. That isn't the response of a man who had anticipated this outcome with certainty. What the emperor did have was a deep knowledge of Horus himself. The two of them had fought side by side for 30 years before the other Primarchs were found. The emperor spent more time with Horus than with any of his other sons. If anyone understood Horus's architecture, the pride, the hunger for recognition, the need to be first, it was the man who made him and raised him. Whether the emperor modeled what that character would eventually do under the right conditions isn't something the primary sources resolve, but the character was there to be read. The closing question the entire argument arrives at is simple to state. Who failed? The emperor failed at some things. He optimized the Great Crusade for speed over safety. He withdrew to Terra without explaining his purpose to the sons who needed to understand it. He built an atheistic doctrine that denied the existence of the very forces that were hunting his children. He didn't sit Horus down and say, "There are gods in the warp. They want you. Here is why. Here is how to resist them." Those are real failures of communication, real policy choices with real downstream costs. Causal responsibility for conditions that created opportunity, the emperor carries some of that. But Horus, inside the Serpent Lodge, with Magnus's warning still ringing in the vision, with his own internal acknowledgement that the visions were meaningless without context, asserted his will anyway. The Lexicanum says what he was full of when he made that choice: pride, betrayal, and lust for power. Not confusion, not ignorance, not a reasonable response to deception he had no tools to recognize. He recognized enough. He had a warning. He had his own doubts. And he decided that if anyone was going to be worshipped as a god, it should be him. That isn't a tragedy of ignorance. That is a tragedy of character. Big E made the right choice, but Horus made an informed decision to still do the wrong thing. If you want more scripts that treat the lore like evidence, subscribe.